welcome to another top 10 list of mine. A very special top 10 list because this is a video I wanted to make for a long time. That being the top 10 most over-recommended movies of all time. And yeah, I know the video is called Top 10 Overrated, but I'm using the term over-recommended for the following reasons. Reason number one, I think the term overrated is ironically overrated. Second, I don't think a movie can be overrated. It can be over-recommended because remember, movie reviews, regardless if it's done as a video, a written article, or simple word of mouth, is a form of recommendation. You're telling someone whether or not they should or shouldn't go see a movie. And a movie still can be good, but maybe there are points in time where maybe people talk about a bit too much. So even though I do call this video Top 10 Overrated Movies of All Time, I'll be referring to each entry as over-recommended. And before I go any further, I do have a few caveats. Just because I think all of these movies are over-recommended does not mean I hate them. I don't. If anything, there are some of these movies that I really do enjoy. I just don't enjoy them as much as other people. Second, no superhero movies on the list whatsoever. And it's not because of my love of superhero movies. It's more because I think there's so many out there that could be a list in and of itself. And third, I'll be doing my list a little differently from most people in that sense where I will definitely talk about the movie in terms of why I think it's over-recommended at first, and then at the end of the segment, I'll give a counter-recommendation in that sense where if you're someone who liked this movie that I thought was over-recommended, here's another movie you should check out if you haven't already. Maybe because it's within the same wheelhouse as this movie I was just talking about, or I think it's a movie that does the same idea, but better in my opinion. And without further ado, here are the top 10 most over-recommended movies of all time. Number 10, The Matrix. I really don't think this movie needs any special introduction, but I do have a story to tell in terms of me trying to watch the movie, because back when this movie first came out, I was in elementary school at the time, and I remember all of my friends kept talking about this movie in terms of how awesome it was, to a point where during recess they would often reenact scenes from the movie itself, especially the famous bullet time sequence. Like, I kept seeing everybody reenact that one moment from this movie. And on top of that, around this time period, this movie was just everywhere in that sense where a lot of other TV shows and movies often parodied the movie to a point where I just had to going, at some point, I just need to watch this movie. And I didn't watch the movie until around middle school for the first time. And when I did, my overall thoughts were that I thought it was fine and nothing else. Because for me, the movie just went in one ear and out the other. I was just a little underwhelmed by the experience. Then I watched all the movies that came afterwards from Matrix Reloaded and Matrix Revolutions, which I could sum up as they have a lot of fantastic action set pieces, but everything else I thought was meh. Now, as far as the Animatrix is concerned, for me it's a mixed bag, but I do remember liking that more than the two sequels. And during my high school years, I decided to rewatch the movie again, and while I definitely appreciated some aspects of it, such as the action scenes, the production values in terms of both the costume and set designs, even if the costumes are a little cheesy in some areas, the cinematography, the designs of some of the machinery like the sentinels that chase after our heroes, and I really did enjoy Lawrence Fishburne and Hugo Weaving's performance as both Morpheus and Agent Smith, respectively, and found their characters to be some of the better written characters of the movie. Everything else, on the other hand, I found the combination of the lore and world building of this movie to be very confusing, although thankfully, it was nowhere near as convoluted as The Matrix Reloaded or Matrix Revolutions. Most of the dialogue I thought was very clunky at some points, especially when they're given exposition dumps. I thought the symbolism in some points was a little too on the nose, such as the naming convention surrounding Neo, given that, first off, Neo is just an anagram of one because Neo is the chosen one. Nonsense. And second, Neo means new because Mr. Anderson became a new person in the form of Neo, which is, again, really on the nose symbolism. The philosophical stuff I thought was also forced in that sense where the movie is trying to force you to think in one particular way as opposed to inspire you to think about something. And then you got the romance between Neo and Trinity, which came out of nowhere because for a good majority of the movie, these two had this platonic relationship with each other. But then during the climax, Trinity just falls in love with Neo, and this comes out of nowhere, among many other things. And I have never felt the need to ever watch this movie again, because why bother watching this movie when I could watch the original 1995 Ghost in the Shell, the movie that inspired The Matrix, along with Ghost in the Shell standalone complex TV series. To me, it's The Matrix done better. But aside the point, around this time period, I actually started to look up movies and saw like what certain movies got receptions, and anytime I saw The Matrix was brought up, I kept seeing it on all of these different top 10 best sci-fi lists, top 10 favorite action movie lists, top 10 favorite movies of all time lists, or if you were to go on IMDb's top 250 list, The Matrix comes in at number 16. I repeat, The Matrix comes in 16th place out of 250 movies. And I just don't get it. And fast forward to the release of The Matrix Resurrections, and when that movie came out, everybody criticized the movie, with the common critique being that it took everything that was great about the original Matrix and ruined it, which I actually found to be really funny considering that I never thought The Matrix was all that great to begin with. And before I go any further, just quick thoughts on The Matrix Resurrections. I thought the movie was incredibly meh. However, I did like the world building and some of the meta aspects in the first third. Other than that, I did think the movie needed to exist. But anywho, what would my alternate recommendation be for this movie? It would be Dark City. Yeah, originally I was just gonna recommend the original 1995 Ghost in the Shell movie, but I feel at least a majority of people know about that movie, so I decided to stick with Dark City instead because I don't feel enough people know about this one. But anywho, as far as Dark City itself is concerned, it's a movie that many people think is a knockoff of The Matrix, even though in reality it actually came out a year before The Matrix. And why I recommend this movie, it has very similar atmosphere and visual aesthetics to The Matrix. It has a really good cast of actors ranging from Rufus Sewell, the late William Hurt, Kiefer Sutherland, Jennifer Connelly, to Richard O'Brien, or Breen, however you pronounce his last name, who plays a character that I can only describe as a prototype of Agent Smith if he was a lot creepier. The movie also has some symbolism that's done in a very vague kind of way, where it inspires you to think as opposed to forces you to think. And the central villains of this movie are inhuman entities who've captured a portion of mankind and give them fantasy lives. And the movie deals with the idea of discovering what makes a human human in this false reality kind of scenario. Although I do have a caveat. If you're gonna watch this movie, I recommend the director's cut, because not only is it slightly longer, which helps with some pacing in some areas, but it also gets rid of this atrocious opening narration that's present in the theatrical cut, which spoils everything. So if you do watch this movie, watch the director's cut. Number 9, The Lion King, a Disney animated movie I'm surprised I don't like as much as everybody else does, because as a kid, I watched quite a bit of Disney products ranging from a lot of the Disney movies, along with the cartoons from the time period, more specifically the ones with a lot of these talking animals, such as Goof Troop, Tailspin, and for better or for worse, the Mighty Ducks cartoon. But when I wasn't watching movies or shows produced by Disney, I was also watching a lot of these animal documentaries produced by Animal Planet or Discovery Channel. So now here's a Disney movie that's exclusively just about talking animals without any fantastical element to it. But for some reason as a kid, this one never drew my attention as much as some of the other ones, to a point that I remember watching this movie the least amount of times growing up. To put these in perspective, I think I seen The Hunchback of Notre Dame more times as a kid than The Lion King. Now, fast forward to my thoughts on the movie as an adult, I think the movie is good, but not that good. Because when you look at the reception this movie gets, it's very highly rated, to a point where, again, you consult IMDb's top 250 movies, this comes in at number 37, and also has like a 93 on Rotten Tomatoes. Or when I look up the various top 10 or even ranking lists revolve around Disney movies, I see a lot of people consider this movie to be either within the top 10, or sometimes I've seen some people put this particular movie at number one, saying that not only is this movie the crowning jewel of the Disney Renaissance era, but it is just Disney's magnum opus as far as their animated content is concerned. And, like I said a few moments ago, I think the movie's good, but I don't think it's that good. Although, before I go any further, I should give some high points about the movie in terms of what I thought worked about it. The animation is really top-notch. Not just for the time period, but even by today's standards, it still holds up. Even the computer-generated stuff, which I didn't even know at the time was computer-generated, actually looks pretty good. The cinematography for certain scenes is also very well done, especially for the stampede sequence, because I didn't realize how epic the cinematography was for that particular scene until rewatching it not too long ago. Rafiki is perhaps one of the coolest Disney characters that Disney had ever produced, and I do like the lesson he gives Simba within the context of the movie, because I think it is a very important lesson for not only kids but adults. And I thought the voice acting was pretty good across the board for most of the characters. And is a very cool way to introduce William Shakespeare's Hamlet to kids who might not know who William Shakespeare is yet, given that The Lion King is just literally a Disney retelling of Hamlet, done in a very clever way. Although, that all said, here are the problems that I have with the movie. First off, I think Simba is pretty boring as far as main characters are concerned for a Disney movie, at least in the second half when he's an adult. First half of the movie, I do find him annoying, but I felt that the actor playing Simba as a cub did give the right amount of energy to play that particular version of Simba, given that the actor playing Simba as a cub is a kid, so that felt appropriate. And not only that, but with the kid voicing Simba as a cub, he had range to his vocals, whereas Matthew Broderick's performance as Simba when he's an adult felt like a missed opportunity. Because when you look at Simba as an adult, on pen and paper, he's someone who's laid back, but they're trying their best to hide their pain. And to me, I just don't think Matthew Broderick was the right voice actor to play that version of Simba. Given that I feel Matthew Broderick's performance as Simba felt very one note compared to the kid actor who played Simba as a cub. My second problem with the movie is Scar, because I was actually liking him as a villain for the first half of the movie up until he took over Pride Rock with the hyenas, because I feel the whole idea of Scar uniting the hyena and lion pride felt like a very underdeveloped concept. And not only that, but I feel that Scar during the last half of the movie didn't quite have the same edge to him as he had in the first half. Although, that all said, I do prefer him over Simba as a character, given that he is voiced by Jeremy Irons, who does give a really good, consistently flamboyant performance as the character. My third problem with the movie are the musical numbers, in that sense where I feel like the musical numbers in this movie are very much a mixed bag, because on the one hand, you have some musical numbers such as The Circle of Life and Be Prepared, which I think are the best songs in the entire movie. But then on the other end, you have Hakuna Matata and Can't Wait to Be King, which I think are not bad, but I consider them to be the weakest songs in the entire movie. Whereas Can You Feel the Love Tonight is somewhere in the middle, where I don't think it's the best, but I don't think it's the worst. And speaking of which, another problem I have with the movie is the romance between Simba and Nala in the second half of the movie, because in the first half, the two of them have a really good friendship with each other, to a point that they make for a really good pair of platonic friends. But suddenly in the second half, when they reunite as adults, they just get into this romantic relationship out of nowhere, kinda like Neo and Trinity's relationship in The Matrix. And not only that, but I always felt it was very underdeveloped to a point that I think the movie would have been better if they didn't go in that direction. And not only that, but if you really know how lion prides function in real life and apply it to this movie, the relationship between Simba and Nala is really gross when you think about it. I could keep going, but I think you get my general point. But other than that, this is just one of those movies that continues to confuse me, because I don't consider this to be a top tier Disney movie like everybody else makes it out to be. For me, The Lion King is not top 10 material. For me, it's lucky if it makes it in the top 30. Actually, to further illustrate this point, and I can't even believe I'm saying this, but I think Kim Possible, So the Drama is a better made movie than The Lion King. Also, there are some points in time throughout the narrative that I did find myself getting very bored at points. So, for my alternate recommendation, I would recommend the 1981 Japanese anime movie The Sea Prince and the Fire Child. As for the plot of this movie, it is yet another retelling of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. And the reasons why I honestly recommend the movie starts with the animation, because honestly, the first time I even saw still images of the movie or even saw out of context video clips, I thought I had stumbled upon lost Disney media from the 1950s, because a lot of the animation to me looked like the type of animation you would have seen in a 1950s animated Disney movie. And not only that, but the animation, even to this day, still looks really gorgeous to look at. And even though the story is just another version of Romeo and Juliet, I did find the narrative to be more engaging, because the actual story itself has a sort of Greek mythological vibe to it, given that this rendition of Romeo and Juliet is told as a fantasy as opposed to a typical realistic drama. And because this rendition of the story is told as a fantasy, stakes are raised even higher, to a point that this movie had a much higher body count than I was expecting, given that we do see the repercussions of why these two star-crossed lovers can't fall in love with each other, for reasons I won't spoil. And while watching the movie, there were points in time that did remind me of The Little Mermaid in some areas, which, again, won't spoil here. I even found most of the characters to be very likable in some areas. And while I don't consider this to be a perfect movie, I still consider it to be a very good one. Although, I will say this much, I wouldn't recommend this to smaller children. I think if you're watching it with older children, it'll be fine, but smaller children, not so much. Number 8, Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope. And before I go any further, I should probably give a little bit of history in terms of our relationship to the franchise, because when it came to watching the original trilogy as a little kid, I remember watching Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi more often than watching this installment, because as a little kid, I honestly thought this movie was pretty boring to sit through, to such a point that I remember getting up to pace around the house before returning to watch this movie again. I was just that bored with the movie when I was a little kid. But as time progressed, and the more times I rewatched all of these Star Wars movies, pre-Disney trilogy, by the way, I did grow to appreciate this installment the older I got. But I always still consider it to be my least favorite installment of the original trilogy. To such a point that I'm actually one of the few people who prefers Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens, even though my biggest critique of the movie is the fact that the narrative is basically just a remake of this movie. I would rather watch that movie any day of the week compared to A New Hope. But anywho, here are my reasons as to why I think Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope is the weakest of the original trilogy, for the following reasons. Reason number one, the pacing is all over the place, because for a good majority of the movie, I felt the pacing was really slow in some parts, especially for the first 45 minutes, because we focus on C-3PO and R2-D2, and I felt their scenes dragged quite a bit in the first 45 minutes of the movie. And even when we get introduced to Luke Skywalker, I still feel that the pacing at this point is still a little slow going. It's not until our main cast of characters join forces with Han Solo and Chewbacca is where I think the movie starts to pick up momentum, because I definitely do enjoy the second half of the movie when we do have our main cast of characters infiltrating the Death Star to rescue Princess Leia. Another aspect of the movie I really didn't like is Luke Skywalker himself, because he doesn't show up until the 45-minute mark of the movie. And not only that, but when we do get introduced to him, he is so goddamn whiny to a point that I couldn't stand him. And the more I thought about it, he's probably the main reason why I never watched this particular installment the most as a little kid, is because of how whiny he is in this movie, which is probably why I watched the other two installments more often than this installment. I also found some bits of dialogue to be a little corny at times. One example that always stood out to me is the point in time where Princess Leia is insulting Grand Moff Tarkin. That I always found to be pretty cheesy, and I know a lot of people always poked fun at some lines of dialogue in the prequel movies, especially the "I hate sand, it's rough, coarse, and gets everywhere" line of dialogue from Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, but have you heard some of the lines of dialogue in this movie? I think they're a little cheesier than the lines of dialogue heard in the prequel movies, in my opinion. And then, of course, you have the lightsaber duel between Obi-Wan and Darth Vader. And here's the thing, nostalgia is a funny thing, because I remember as a kid, I remember that lightsaber duel being pretty epic, but upon watching it now, I found it to be very underwhelming, which is sad because, cinematically speaking, this is the first lightsaber duel we ever seen within the entirety of the Star Wars franchise. And I feel that every other lightsaber duel that came out in future installments were a lot better than the lightsaber duel that's presented in this movie. But then you look at the reception this movie gets, and it's often a very highly praised movie to a point where you see on multiple top 10 lists ranging from top 10 best science fiction movies of all time, top 10 favorite movies of all time in general. And again, referring back to the IMDb's top 250 list, Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope comes in 29th place out of 250 movies. And I think the reason why the movie is so highly praised is probably a combination of nostalgia, because a lot of people saw this as a kid, and the fact that it was the very first Star Wars movie that revolutionized cinema for the time period, because no one had ever seen anything like it before up to that point. That all said, if I had to give any praise to this movie, I still enjoy a lot of the production value, from the production design, from the sets to the costumes. Special effects are still pretty on point. You also have the musical score done by John Williams. The movie also has some pretty breathtaking cinematography at points, and the movie does have plenty of memorable scenes, from the opening tidbit with Darth Vader capturing Princess Leia, and the movie in some areas is a lot funnier than I remember. And on top of that, the movie is just one gigantic mashup of different ideas, because as far as the story is concerned, it's very much a fantasy story set in a science fiction setting, but incorporates elements from samurai flicks along with westerns, while taking inspiration from a lot of the early Flash Gordon serials from the 1930s and mixing it all together, resulting in the movie we got today. Now, what would my alternate recommendation for this movie be? Flash Gordon, savior of the universe. Sorry, I couldn't help myself there, but anywho, my alternate recommendation would be the 1980s Flash Gordon movie, and only because we're in a John Carter kind of situation, in that sense where here's a movie that a lot of people thought was a ripoff or a knockoff of Star Wars, even though it's a movie based off source material that predated Star Wars, that actually served as a key ingredient in the creation of Star Wars, given that a lot of the plot points and tropes you see in that original movie are all seen within the context of this movie, where you have this main character who is this reluctant hero that goes on this epic journey to fight against this intergalactic tyrant who has a weapon that can destroy planets, joins a rebellion in the process, and even the villains themselves are also very similar to the villains you would see in Star Wars, where you have Emperor Ming the Merciless, General Kallus, and General Kala serving as stand-ins for Darth Sidious, Darth Vader, and Admiral Grand Moff Tarkin, respectively. The soundtrack is also done by Queen. Yes, that Queen, featuring Freddie Mercury. The movie also has really great production values in regards to its costume design, set designs, small-scale miniatures. The movie also has great momentum in regards to its pacing, and the main character, although he is a complainer, I put him in the same ballpark as like a Bruce Campbell hero, in that sense where, yes, he complains a lot, but he also has his moments of being a badass, and I found him to be much more likable than Luke Skywalker in Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope. And the movie is just a lot of fun. Number 7, Monty Python, the Holy Grail. And I have a very lengthy story to tell with this one in regards to my attempts to watch it. Because I remember in elementary school, and much like The Matrix, this was also one of those properties that all my friends, both in my own grade and the grade above me, constantly quoted. To a point that I never bothered seeing the TV show because all my friends just quoted the show nonstop. And then, of course, you have this movie, which, again, much like the TV show, is something that everybody kept quoting. Now, fast forward to my years during high school, and my attempt to watch this movie has got to be one of the most frustrating experiences ever, because I remember during my freshman year of high school, I used to be a part of the Boy Scouts, and there was this one camporee we were about to head off to, and the theme was movies, in which, if you were attending the camporee at the time, your troop had to have a theme revolved around a particular movie, provided it's below the rating of a PG-13. So we had to do something that was PG, and everybody in my troop chose Monty Python, the Holy Grail. Again, up to this point, I still had never seen the movie. So now the camporee is underway, and during late Friday, one of the adults brought in a screen projector to watch the movie. So this was my first time trying to watch the movie. And we get from the start of the movie up until the Castle Tourette stuff. And then we hear this beagle sound. And for those of you unaware, when you're at a camper and you hear the beagle sound off, that basically means lights out quite a bit. So we never finished the movie. And I thought that maybe we were going to finish the movie tomorrow, but nope. The weekends went by and we never completed the movie. Fast forward to my sophomore year of high school. And I tried to watch this movie on 2 different occasions. Once during band class, because the band instructor wasn't there one time, so they hired a substitute to simply have all the bandmates watch My Python Holy Grail. And again, much like the camporee, we start the movie and get up to around the Castle Tourette stuff, and then we hear the bell, which means move on to your next class. So again, we never finished the movie. Now comes my third and final attempt to watch this movie, which happened to be during one time me and some friends of mine who were a part of this first robotics team decided to spend a night at this one friend's place because they lived in the middle of the sticks, and we were trying to figure out what to watch for a movie, and sure enough, everyone decided Monty Python the Holy Grail. And again, we start the movie and we get up to the Castle Tourette stuff, and then that's where we stop the movie because everybody kept falling asleep. And this is literally the third time in a row where I've seen the first half of the movie, but I never saw the rest of it. And because I've tried to watch this movie on multiple occasions and only got up to the Castle Tourette stuff, I didn't bother watching the movie again for a long time. Now, fast forward to my freshman year of college, and for the first time since my sophomore year of high school, I finally managed to watch this movie in its entirety, and when the movie ended, I was severely underwhelmed by what I had seen. Because growing up, I always kept hearing my friends from elementary school to high school constantly quoting this movie or laughing with the movie as we were watching it, and now that I finally watched the whole thing from start to finish, I was just confused by what I had seen. Then when I look up the kind of reception this movie gets, it has a 8.2 out of 10 on IMDb, a 96 on Rotten Tomatoes, or you see this movie on multiple top 10 lists, everything ranging from top 10 greatest comedies of all time, top 10 quintessential comedies, or top 100 movies you need to watch before you die. I could keep going. But sometimes, even when I look up people's favorite movies or comedies on YouTube, this movie always pops up, and I just never connected with it. Because like I have said time and time again, much like horror, comedy is also very subjective. But with that all said, what are my actual thoughts on this movie? First off, even though this movie didn't necessarily have the largest of budgets, the filmmakers knew how to use it, resulting in a lot of good production values from the costumes and set designs that were used throughout the movie, even if most of the sets were just shot on location. I actually like the tidbit with the killer rabbit because not only is it a very funny sequence altogether, having King Arthur say, Jesus Christ, to actually seeing the rabbit kill all these men. But historically speaking, the idea of a killer rabbit was something that originated in medieval literature during the 12th century. I mean, to put things in perspective, there's a facade on the Notre Dame before it burnt down of a hunter being hunted by a rabbit. And I do like the fact that the wizard character in this is simply named Tim. Because if this was any other movie, you could just give this character a really epic name like Merlin or Gandalf, but no, his name is just Tim. Perhaps one of the most mundane names you could think of for this wizard. Now, as far as the actual humor itself is concerned, for me, it's kind of how I view the humor to most of the Phase 4 Marvel movies, in a sense where it's very hit and miss. There are definitely some segments that I found to be very funny, again, like the scene with the rabbit, but then there's just some points that I didn't think were that funny, like the point in time where you have a couple of characters encountering the Knights of Ni, because they're knights that say Ni. What else? And this is one of those movies where I like the idea conceptually, where it's just a comical retelling of King Arthur. I like the idea, it's the execution not so much, because there's a lot of comical segues that occur throughout this movie that honestly didn't need to be there. Case in point, the famous scene of King Arthur's duel against the Black Knight. As funny as that scene is, it has no real bearing over the story whatsoever, to a point that you can remove that scene altogether and nothing would be affected. That's how I feel about a lot of the comical scenes throughout the movie, where you could just remove them and nothing would change, because all the comical scenes don't really have any effect over the narrative. Then you have some segments where they cut back and forth between the live action segments and some animated sequences, and the animation to me is very crude. Now again, this could be because of budgetary reasons, but from what I remember, because apparently there was a My Pythons and the Flying Circus TV show or something, a TV show which I have never seen, because again, like I said earlier, all my friends constantly quoted Monty Python to me, to a point that I never felt the need to watch the TV show. And from my understanding, apparently the show had some animated segments too. Not sure if they looked any better or worse than the ones featured in this movie, so I don't know, but aside the point, the animation was not very good. And then of course you have the ending, which for me has to be one of the stupidest ways you could possibly end a movie. Because if there is any reoccurring plotline throughout this whole movie, you got something to do with cops investigating a person dying or something. And the movie would just cut back to these random cops. And I sat there thinking, okay, well, what do these cops have to do with the King Arthur stuff? Sure enough, they come back, arrest King Arthur and some of the other knights, and then the movie just cuts to black and you hear music playing in the background. And I'm not gonna lie, the first time this occurred, I was not only confused, but during the segment where you just focus on nothing but like the blackness of the screen before the credits start rolling, I was literally concerned because I thought the website we were watching on maybe didn't load the video all the way, or the internet was down. But no, apparently that's just how the movie actually ends, and I thought that was just the stupidest way to end a movie like this. And on top of that, anytime I watch a movie, I'm usually watching it for the narrative or characters, and I know that when you're watching a comedy, you're usually there for the humor. But for me, this movie just focused way too much on the humor, and I just felt the narrative was non-existent. So, if I had to sum up my thoughts on the entire movie, it would go something like this. On second thought, let's not go to Camelot. It is a silly place, so for my alternate recommendation, it would be Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. For a simple reason that, if I had to describe this movie in a nutshell, it's basically Guardians of the Galaxy, but instead of being set in space, it's set in a fantasy world. I thought the narrative was a lot more compelling. It knew when to balance out the serious moments with the comical moments. And speaking of the humor, this movie is a lot funnier than I thought it was going to be, and I was consistently laughing more with this movie, and the movie also lives up to its premise in a way that made sense. And not only that, but the movie also has some really good production values, from the cinematography, the set designs, the costumes, even the practical effects in this were amazing to look at. And overall, I thought the new D&D movie was a really great movie, and felt like the type of blockbuster movie you would have seen back during the early 2000s, like Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl. And I mean this in the best possible way. Coming in at number 6, A Quiet Place. And before this movie even hit theaters, when I first learned about this movie through the trailer and its premise, I was immediately hooked, because the first thing I thought of was that this was going to be this decade's equivalent to Tremors, which is one of my favorite horror movies of all time, given that it has a very similar premise where you have this monster movie in which the monster in question hunts people through sound while stuck in a very isolated location. And sure enough, when the movie eventually premiered, it was met with a lot of high praise, with a lot of people praising the premise in terms of how original it was, to the performances of some of the actors, most notably Emily Blunt and the deaf actress, if I remember correctly, to the overall direction of the movie. And on top of the movie getting really good reception upon its release, I remember also seeing this movie appear on multiple top 10 best movies of 2018 lists. And for a while, people wouldn't shut up about this movie. It was just one of those cases where I really needed to see this movie, and I did eventually get around to seeing it, and when I did, I was very underwhelmed by what I saw. But before I even get into that, praises I can give this movie. This movie is a good example of how to do visual storytelling. Because you have to remember, movies are a visual medium in which they use visuals to tell their story. And if you're able to understand the combination of the characters and plot through the visuals without any lines of dialogue or music playing in the background, you hit your mark. Because you should be able to understand what your movie is about through the visuals alone. And this movie definitely succeeds in that regard, because the movie is just exactly that. Visual storytelling, where it uses the visuals of what these characters are going through to tell its story. And another aspect I can give praise to is John Krasinski's, if I'm pronouncing his last name right, overall direction for this movie. Given that, from my understanding, he started out as an actor who mainly played in a lot of comedies before transitioning into a more serious director. So he at least had good, competent direction for this particular movie. I also thought the movie had some really good cinematography, which also ties back into the whole visual storytelling aspect of the movie itself. But like I said earlier, when I saw this movie for the first time, I was very underwhelmed by it. Because here's this movie that got a lot of high praise, yet I thought the overall movie was just okay. Not bad, mind you, just okay. And here are my problems with the movie itself. First problem being the way that people talk about the premise. Because again, at the time of the movie's release, everybody gave a lot of high praise to the idea of the narrative itself, where you have a group of people being stalked by creatures that hunt by sound. They made it sound as if this idea had never been done before, which basically communicated the idea that a lot of people who saw this movie clearly had never seen Tremors. Second problem that I have with the movie is the overall design of the creature itself, because the first time I ever saw the creature on screen, my first immediate thought was that the creature in this movie looked a lot like the Demogorgon from Stranger Things. If the Demogorgon had longer and lankier arms, along with having more facial plates on its face. Sure, the way the creature behaves and hunts is completely different from how the Demogorgon behaves and hunts, but as far as the overall design aesthetic is concerned, they looked a little too similar for my taste. Another problem I had with the movie is that A Quiet Place falls into some cliches of the horror genre, where you have a character or two do something unintentionally stupid in order for the story to progress. One example being when the mother is going downstairs to the basement and she ends up stepping on a nail which is sticking up in the middle of the staircase, which also begs the question, why was it there to begin with and why leave it up after stepping on it? Actually, something else I just thought of, because there's a moment where you have the father-son talking near a waterfall, because they establish that if you're near a running body of water like a river or a waterfall, it's okay to make noise, given that the river and water are making a constant noise, which for some reason wouldn't attract one of these creatures, or it would just ignore it altogether. And I sat there going, wait, if you knew that it was a-okay to make noise around a running body of water like a river or waterfall, why not just build a log cabin or live near the waterfall? Which is especially dumb considering that the mother in the movie is pregnant? And speaking of the mother being pregnant, first off, why would you want to have a baby and raise it in this kind of environment where you have to constantly be quiet in order to not attract one of these creatures? And second, the moment in which we see her give birth, I thought was a little too unbelievable for that moment in the movie. Another problem I have with the movie is the rules, because this movie establishes very clearly that there are some rules. The big one being don't make any sound. because there was a point in time where one of the characters accidentally made this loud banging sound. The creature never showed up. Yet the moment they're playing a dice game and they accidentally roll one of the dice on like a hard surface and it makes some noise, it attracts one of these creatures. It just didn't make any sense to me. Now, sure, I only saw the movie the one time, and maybe I'm misremembering something, but again, it just seems like the movie has this pre-established rule, yet they kind of break it a couple times throughout the movie. I also thought the characters in the movie were pretty bland because I didn't think there was too much to them, or if they had any type of characterization, it was just bare minimum stuff in that, okay, this is the father, this is the mother, these are the two kids, one of them's deaf, and nothing else beyond that. And then you got the ending. I have multiple problems with the ending. Starting with the shotgun, because earlier in the movie, one of the kids has a very dramatic encounter with one of these creatures, and one of the other characters sets off some fireworks to distract it, which succeeds. Yet, after the climax, in which we see the mother and kids kill this creature with a shotgun, we cut to the outside and we see a pack of these creatures running towards their direction, which made me wonder, why is it that the shotgun was able to bring these creatures in while the fireworks only seem to distract the one? The second problem I have with this shotgun is that earlier in the movie, we see a newspaper clipping showcasing a soldier attempting to fight off one of these creatures with a machine gun, and it's implied that a lot of the military forces from around the world have taken severe damage and or have completely been decimated because no weapon can harm these creatures. Yet the climax of the movie has our main cast of characters killing one of these creatures with a shotgun. I mean, there's a little bit more to it than that, but still, they were able to use a weapon like a shotgun to kill one of these creatures, yet you're telling me the military, which have more advanced weapons, couldn't kill these creatures? Then you have the final few moments of the movie, which really ruins the tone of the movie, because for a good majority of the movie, the overall tone of the movie is really serious, yet literally within the final seconds of the movie, we see the mother load her shotgun, cock it, and just kind of smirks. And I don't know what it is, but the tone in terms of how that scene plays out felt a little bit too comical for my taste, because it totally did not mesh with the rest of the movie. I could go on and on, but I think you get my point. So, what would my alternate recommendation for A Quiet Place be? I would recommend the 1990s classic creature feature Tremors for the following reasons. Reason number one, it does the whole having a group of people being attacked by a group of monsters that hunt by sound in an isolated geographical area concept a lot better. Second, the characters are a lot more memorable and well defined than the characters in A Quiet Place. Third, it has really good sound design in terms of how sound is used in the movie itself. It also has really good special effects for the time period. And while I myself don't consider this movie to be a horror comedy, the movie knows how to keep a good consistent tone and balance out the comical bits with the more serious horror elements. And as far as the monsters of the movie are concerned, the graboids, I think they function a lot better as a threat to our main cast of human characters as opposed to the creatures from A Quiet Place in terms of both their design and mannerisms, because their designs are instantly recognizable, even if they are just a giant worm. And second, they're an ever-escalating threat in that sense where just when you have the main cast of characters believing that they figured out how these things function, the creatures throw a curveball, raising the stakes. Not only that, but this movie actually does something that's pretty unique even for a horror movie, which is you have the cast of main characters consistently making smart decisions while dealing with the ever-escalating threat of the graboids. Or when you do see a character make a stupid mistake, it actually makes sense within the context of the narrative. Then you have the fact that all the characters don't break any rules within the context of the movie because there are no established rules to begin with when our main cast of characters first encounter the graboids. And not only that, but I objectively think Tremors is a much better made movie than A Quiet Place. Number 5, Gamera 3, The Incomplete Struggle, or as it was called here in the United States, Gamera 3, Revenge of Iris. And before I go any further, I should probably give a little bit of history in terms of who or what Gamera is, because during the 1960s, Godzilla was big. So big, in fact, that he inspired countless imitators across the planet because everybody was trying to cash in on his success, with Gorgo from Great Britain, Reptilicus from Denmark, and Yongari from South Korea, among many others. But out of all of the Godzilla imitators to exist, one stood out the most, and depending on who you ask, he is either considered to be the most famous or infamous giant monster to have spawned in the wake of Godzilla's popularity, that being Gamera, a giant fire-breathing flying tusked turtle, who happens to be the friend of all children, given that a lot of the movies he appeared in were geared more towards children, and of all the imitators, he's the one that lasted the longest, appearing in a total of 8 movies from 1965 up to 1980. And even though he appeared in quite a few movies, Gamera was a monster that lived in Godzilla's shadow. Now, fast forward to the year 1995, and this year's very significant because this was the year that Godzilla vs. Destroyer came out, which at the time was the final installment of what many people refer to as the Heisei era, a set of movies that started in 1984 and ended in 1995. Given that this is a continuity of movies that ignored a good majority of the original Godzilla movies with the exception of the 1954 Godzilla movie. And with 1995's Godzilla vs. Destroyer making this the final chapter of that particular set of movies. And as Godzilla's journey was ending, Gamera's new journey was about to begin, resulting in what many people refer to as the Heisei trilogy, a set of movies that were more dark and thoughtful than the original cartoony movies that were produced during the mid-60s to early 80s. And to get an idea of how different tonally these incarnations of Gamera were, compare the Adam West Batman to the Christopher Nolan Batman, and you get the same idea. And this is a trilogy of movies that has garnered a lot of high praise to a point where many people say it's not only the best set of Gamera movies to exist, but some people even go as far as to say they're some of the best giant monster movies to ever exist. To such a point that it made Gamera, a monster that used to live in Godzilla's shadow, is now walking alongside him, joining the roster of one of many iconic giant monsters to hail from Japanese cinema. But with all that said, let's actually talk about the third and final installment of the Heisei Gamera trilogy, being Gamera 3, The Incomplete Struggle, or Gamera 3, The Revenge of Iris, a movie that many people claim is not only the best Gamera movie, but it's also one of the best giant monster movies ever made, to a point where many have said that Gamera 3, The Revenge of Iris, is the giant monster equivalent to The Dark Knight. And while I think the movie is good, I don't think it's this masterpiece that people have made it out to be. Because when I look at the movie itself, it actually has a lot of good ingredients, from a main character who's a kid that hates Gamera because of that occurs in the first movie. It also takes a lot of key plot points and events from the previous 2 movies and expands upon them in a way that's mind-blowing. It also expands upon the mythology established in the first movie, and also the special effects in this movie, from the summation, the small-scale miniatures, to the CGI, is top-notch stuff. The soundtrack is fantastic, and Gamera, in terms of both design and personality, is a lot darker and aggressive than he has ever been in any installment of the franchise, among many other things. It's just, when looking at the movie itself, although good, I do find it to be very underwhelming in some regards. First off, for a movie called Gamera, Gamera himself doesn't really appear much in the movie, because keep in mind, of any installment of the Gamera franchise, this is by far the longest one, clocking at 1 hour and 48 minutes, almost a 2-hour movie. And Gamera only shows up for the first 10 to 15 minutes, and then he disappears until the final 10 to 15 minutes of the movie. So within the good majority of the time, he's just not on screen. And although the characters talk about him, he's barely on screen as it is. And then you have the inclusion of the new monster Iris, which, on the one hand, I do think he has a very cool looking design, and I do like his origin in a sense where it's very ambiguous, where you have a lot of characters speculate in terms of what he is, but there's no concrete origin for him, so it's left up to interpretation. But I found found the monster's personality to be very lacking. Because when he first shows up as this tiny little creature, he actually seems cute and docile, but then when he gets into his adult form, he seemed very lifeless. And I'd heard a lot of people say, oh, this is the toughest monster Gamera ever fought against. I mean, yeah, Gamera lost an arm during the fight, but if Gamera was able to beat him, no problem. I felt that the monster Gamera fought against in the movie before this was much tougher than this creature. And not only that, but I feel that a lot of the human stuff really bogs down the movie, because one of the best aspects about the first installment of this trilogy was the way the movie balanced out the human stuff with the monster stuff to a point where if you remove the human stuff, the monster stuff wouldn't make any sense, and if you remove the monster stuff, the human stuff wouldn't make any sense. They were connected in ways that worked. This here, it just felt like they put all their eggs into the human stuff and not enough on the monster stuff to me. Not only that, but they introduced a bunch of new characters, two of them being this duo of nihilists who try to manipulate events towards a state of entropy. And not only that, but I felt like anytime they were on screen, I felt like the information they were delivering was very convoluted and unnecessary to a point that I think it would have been better if the movie had removed these two characters altogether. And not only that, but this movie does this thing where for a good majority of its runtime, because of all the events that have transpired in the previous two movies and in this movie, it feels like the movie was trying to build up towards this big catastrophe of world-ending proportions. But perhaps one of the most infamous aspects of the movie is the way it ends. Because after Gamera defeats Iris, we see this ginormous swarm of bats flying towards Gamera's location. And as we see Gamera head off to fight this gigantic swarm of bats, the movie ends on a cliffhanger. To get an idea of how disappointing this ending is, imagine you're watching the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, but instead of having the franchise continue past Avengers Endgame, imagine if the final installment was Thor Ragnarok, and you get the same idea. Then again, this movie to me never felt like a third and final installment. If anything, it felt more like a setup for another movie that never happened. Sure, I understand that the movie was trying to have a more ambiguous ending, given that when this trilogy started, the first installment was about establishing the faith in Gamera. The second installment was about sustaining the faith in Gamera, whereas this installment, it's about having faith in Gamera. I get that. It's just the way it was executed came off less ambiguous, and like I said a few moments ago, it felt more like a setup to another installment that never happened, as opposed to a third and final installment. So, what would my alternate recommendation be for this movie? It would be Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah Giant Monsters All-Out Attack. And yes, that is the actual title of the movie, but moving forward, I'll just refer to it as GMK. And why I would recommend GMK over Gamera 3 The Revenge of Iris, even though they're both directed by the same person, within the context of the Godzilla franchise, GMK is the overall 26th installment of the franchise. And this is perhaps the most unique and original installment, given that instead of being a sci-fi movie, it's more of a supernatural thriller, given that all of the giant monsters in this movie have a mystical quality to them, with Godzilla being death incarnate in that sense, where it's this demonic entity that's comprised of those who died during World War II that seek vengeance upon Japan for its wartime aggression, as opposed to being a giant dinosaur that was either awakened or mutated by the atomic bomb testings. And as far as his monster co-stars are concerned, King Ghidorah, Mothra, and Baragon are depicted more as folklore entities. And not only that, but this movie really plays around with mythology in a very big way, given that King Ghidorah this time around, instead of being the bad guy, he's depicted as one of the good guys. To get an idea of how bizarre this is, imagine if characters such as the Joker, Megatron, or the Brotherhood of Mutants were the good guys, while Batman, Optimus Prime, and the X-Men were the bad guys. And you get the same idea. And not only that, but the human element in this movie is also done much better, because much like Gamera Guardian of the Universe, the movie knows when to balance out the human characters with the monster characters in a way way in which, again, if you were to remove the human characters, the monster stuff wouldn't make any sense since they affect the monster stuff. And if you were to remove the monster stuff, it wouldn't make sense for the human stuff because the monster stuff also affects the human element. The special effects are also top-notch, from the suitmation and the small-scale miniatures. Sure, the CGI in some areas can be a little wonky, but it's still pretty good for the most part and functions as intended. The musical score in this is fantastic. And while the movie ends on a cliffhanger, it ends in a way where you're satisfied that it ends on a cliffhanger, given that all of the events that transpired from the beginning of the movie do get some resolution at the very end of it. And while you might technically have to watch the original 1954 Godzilla movie to understand certain plot beats for this particular installment, I still think GMK is a fantastic movie worth watching. Number 4, Only Yesterday. And for frame of context, this is a Studio Ghibli movie that for the longest time didn't have a proper release here in the United States for the longest time until recently. But aside from that, even when I was learning about the reception of certain Studio Ghibli movies in terms of what were considered the worst to best, I noticed that Only Yesterday is considered to be one of the best movies of the Studio Ghibli catalog. Because when you look on the Rotten Tomato list ranking from worst to best, Only Yesterday comes in second place, outbeating other Studio Ghibli movies such as Princess Mononoke, Keys Delivery Service, and Grave of the Fireflies. Now sure, it's a Rotten Tomatoes list, so I usually take that kind of information with a grain of salt, but even looking past that, when I look at tier lists or ranking videos on YouTube, Only Yesterday is very highly praised, usually within the top 10 or even top 5 sometimes. So eventually when me and some of my family members decided to check the movie out, and when the movie ended, we were very underwhelmed by what we had seen and confused by why this movie was so highly praised. Because on the one hand, yes, the animation in regards to the landscapes is beautiful, which is not surprising given that this is a Studio Ghibli product, but everything else to me just fell to the wayside for the following reasons. Reason number 1, the character animation didn't look as refined as it has been seen in other Studio Ghibli movies that came out before or after this, in that sense where it felt like I was watching a TV-made movie as opposed to a theatrical movie. Reason number 2, the framing device for the movie. Because the way the movie is set up, it's set during the present day, where we focus on a woman who's in her mid to late 20s, and she periodically has flashbacks to her childhood during the 5th grade. And we see a lot of what transpired in the 5th grade in terms of what shaped her into the adult she is now. And I just feel like the framing device here didn't live up to its full potential, because I feel like if this was any other movie, we would cut back to different points in her life, where maybe we do see a little bit of what she was like in elementary school, maybe what she did during high school, and what she was like during college. That we see like all these life events that occur throughout these different time periods in terms of what turned her into the current person she is today. But no, instead we just focus on nothing more than the flashbacks during her time in the 5th grade and nothing else. Reason number 3, the way the flashback segments connect to the present day segments don't always line up very well, because there are some segments where she says, oh yeah, this reminds me of this one little thing I used to do, and we see a flashback of her doing exactly that. But then there's some segments they focus on which have nothing to do with anything, both within the context of the flashbacks or the present day stuff, to a point that I feel like if you just remove those segments out altogether, I don't think anything would have changed all that much. Reason number 4, the movie tries to have a ambiguous ending, but it fails, because the movie has the main character interacting with this man, and towards the end of the movie it's kind of revealed that the man has some kind of feelings for her, but she doesn't really have any feelings for him. But then the ending happens, and then suddenly out of nowhere she just has feelings for this dude, and the movie just ends. But even if the movie were to have a proper ending, I think if she and the other character were to get into a relationship, I think it would have served as a cheap conclusion to the narrative, given that the movie is about internal exploration and making peace with both yourself and the past. Reason number 5. The whole movie is a 2-hour coming-of-age slice of life, and I'm sorry, I'm just not a big fan of slice of life type shows or movies. To me, they've never been my cup of tea. I always found them to be very boring, as it were. Especially this one. It was just 2 hours, and I just never been so bored watching a movie. Now, sure, a movie like Kiki's Delivery Service or The Secret World of Arinetti are both slice of life, but there's a fantastical element to them that make them interesting. This movie, on the other hand, I just did not care for whatsoever. Reason number 6. The overall character design for the main character in terms of what she looks like in the present day versus how she looked when she was in the 5th grade don't look anything alike. Because when I first saw the poster and saw these two standing next to each other, I was under the impression that one of them was the teacher and the other one was the student. But upon watching the movie, you realize these two are the same character. And because they look and act so differently from one another, I just didn't get the impression that this was supposed to be the same character. Because when you watch the movie in full, it cuts back and forth between what she's like in the present day versus what she was like in the 5th grade. They both act completely different from one another to a point that I was convinced I was watching two different characters, not the same character. I could keep going, but I think you get my point. Although, that all said, this is actually the first movie I watched in some time where I actually got mad while watching it. Because not only was I mad at key moments that occurred throughout the movie, but I also got pretty angry. Because here's a movie that, although I don't think it's bad, I think it's just okay, yet I don't really understand why this movie has such high praise. Because to me, I don't consider this to be a high tier Studio Ghibli movie. If anything, I consider this to be like a bottom 5 tier movie for me. To put things in perspective, I would rather sit through Tales from Earthsea again, a Studio Ghibli movie that's usually considered to be one of the worst, if not the worst, than sit through this movie again. So, for my alternate recommendation for Only Yesterday would be Words Bubble Up Like Soda Pop. Because even though this is a, I believe, straight-to-streaming movie for Netflix, it doesn't look like a straight-to-streaming movie. It actually looks like this could have had a theatrical release. And not only that, but the animation is really unique in that sense where not only is it very bright and vibrant, but the way it moves, it almost reminded me of watercolors in a sense. And before I go any further, I just need to remind you that slice of life, coming of age stuff is usually not my cup of tea, especially in regards to Only Yesterday, because I felt the reason why I was so bored watching that movie because it felt like nothing really happened, for me at least. Whereas this movie, on the other hand, even though it is a slice of life coming of age story, I was very much engaged with this movie's narrative because there was something going on within the story that kept me engaged from start to finish. And not only that, but the movie did not overstay its welcome. It ended on the right appropriate note in a way that was satisfying. And while this movie doesn't really touch upon the same ideas that were presented in Only Yesterday, the ideas this movie does express are ones that revolve around expressing yourself earnestly and making memories while you still can. And I actually found the romance in this movie to be really cute. And not only that, but I felt the romance between our two lead characters was a lot more believable in this movie than it was in Only Yesterday. And although the second half of this movie does get a little more serious, I do love the general laid-back vibes of this entire movie because it feels like you're chilling with this cast of characters. Overall, I think this is a cute and harmless way to pass the time. And before I go any further, something you need to know about the top 3 movies on this list. These 3 movies I think are so over-recommended that I actually have not one but multiple alternate recommendations for each movie. And without further delay, coming in at number 3, The Green Knight. Now, before I go any further, I'm not too familiar with the A24 catalog, as I've only ever seen a handful of movies, everything from Ex Machina, Everything Everywhere All at Once, which I thought were really good movies, while Under the Skin I thought was okay. As for this movie, on the other hand, when it first premiered, this movie was met with a lot of high praise, with mainstream movie critics, cinephiles, even high-profile movie review YouTubers giving it the highest praise possible. The movie's also got a 89% on Rotten Tomatoes, Tomatoes. It was on multiple top 10 best movies of 2021. And I've even heard some people say this is one of the best movies to come out in the last decade, to even some people say it's one of the top 10 best fantasy movies of all time because of its deconstructive nature. And going into this, I had to temper my expectations because I have heard that the film catalog of A24 is very hit and miss in that sense, where all their movies are loved by, again, major movie critics and cinephiles, but casual moviegoers just hate their stuff. I also heard that trailers for a lot of their movies are very misleading, where the trailer sells you one type of movie, but the movie itself is completely different. And I think The Green Knight is no example to this, because when you watch the trailer, it's advertised like it's gonna be this Lord of the Rings type epic fantasy. And in reality, it's not that at all. So upon watching it, I had to temper my expectations quite a bit, knowing that it wasn't gonna be this Lord of the Rings style movie. And upon watching it, it's not that at all. It's a very meditative kind of movie, if that makes any sense. But anywho, my overall thoughts on the movie are that it's alright. Although before I go any further, I should probably point out the positives of the movie, because I think the movie, in terms of its production values, are amazing. In regards to having good cinematography, set designs, costume designs. The movie's also very well paced, and the movie was shot on location in Ireland, which has really nice landscapes. And not only that, but the movie also had really good color composition in terms of how it used color for certain scenes. Now, with that all said, why do I think this movie is over-recommended? Actually, before I even go into that detail, as you probably mentioned, I have never read the poem this movie is based upon, but I have watched videos that describe what generally happens in the poem. And from my understanding, it seems that the poem itself is short in that sense where not much really happens, but also the ending's very different. So with that all said, my thoughts in terms of why I think this movie is over-recommended. For starters, a lot of high praise this movie gets is that apparently it does a good job of capturing Sir Gawain's existential dread. I feel like this is an angle that wasn't explored enough, because I feel that throughout the entire movie there's only 2 points in time where they play with this idea, but they don't go further with it. So I think they could have added some more existential dread to certain parts of the movie. Second, the impression I get from watching this movie is that it feels as if it was originally supposed to be a 40 to 45 minute short film, but for whatever reason they decided to extend the movie by adding a lot of material that wasn't even in the story. And not only that, but I felt a lot of the scenes that they did add honestly didn't contribute to the overall narrative, to such a point that I honestly think you could have removed a lot of these scenes and I don't think anything would have been affected. For example, there's this one scene that a lot of film critics give high praise to because they thought the combination of the CGI was amazing. They also thought the scene itself was very awe-inspiring. Is a point in time where we see Sir Gawain and this fox stumble upon a group of giants. And this scene has so little to do with the narrative that you could have removed it from the movie and I don't think anything would have been affected, much like other parts of the movie. And not only that, but the scene with the giants, really? People thought the CGI here was good? I thought it was pretty mediocre at best. And really? People thought this was awe-inspiring? Honestly, I thought a lot of the giant monster scenes that occur in the 2019 Godzilla King of the Monsters movie were a lot more awe-inspiring and had much better special effects. And it's not that I don't think you could extend the story. I think you could, it's just the way they went about it would not have been the way I would have done it. Also, this movie just feels like it's one of those kind of movies where it's trying to be this philosophical masterpiece about honor and legacy while trying to deconstruct the tropes of the fantasy genre. Or at least that's my interpretation of the movie. But the idea doesn't feel properly executed. Again, going back to certain aspects of the narrative, what I think they should have done was keep the first third as it is, and instead of having the last 2 acts of the movie be Sir Gawain on his journey to the Green Chapel, I think the second act of the movie should have occurred over the course of 1 year of him going on these various quests to better leave a legacy, because he doesn't doesn't want to be remembered as the guy that gets decapitated by the Green Knight, with the last act being him on his journey to the Green Chapel. And I think between the start of the second act up until the final moments of the movie, he should have experienced the 5 stages of grief. The first one being denial, with him interacting with people, with everyone knowing his story, be like, oh, you're going to get decapitated by the Green Knight. Be like, nah, you got the wrong guy. Then sometime we see him on a mission where he's confronting some kind of creature like the questing beast. Kills the beast, but because people just acknowledge that, oh, you're still going to get decapitated, he's just angry about it. Then which would eventually lead to him bargaining with King Arthur not to go on the journey, with King Arthur basically telling him, no, you need to see this through. You know, this is where you can actually play with, like, the character's psyche at this moment. Then at the start of the third act, you have him going through some depression issues. And then when he confronts the Green Knight, you have him confront the final stage of grief, acceptance, or something like that. And speaking of the ending, I have a couple problems with this ending, because on top of being very different from the poem, from how I understand it, it doesn't quite feel like it ends on the right note, because I think I get what the filmmaker was trying to do by have the movie end on a more ambiguous note, allowing you to decide whether or not the Green Knight decapitated Sir Gawain or not, but it doesn't really come off that way. It just feels like the movie was about to lead to something, but then suddenly it just ends. Again, I do think there is a way to do it, but not like this. Not only that, but I do think the movie's biggest problem is the symbolism and social commentary that it presents, because the movie puts a lot more stock in its symbolism and social commentary that I feel the narrative and character writing suffers because of it. And here's the thing, I got nothing against movies that have symbolism or social commentary, as long as it's in the background. Because to me, I think having good characters and narrative are far more important than symbolism and social commentary. But when you put a lot more stock into the symbolism or social commentary, but not too much in the narrative or characters, I think the movie suffers because of it. So for my alternate recommendations, the first one goes to the Walt Disney Paramount co-production Dragon Slayer. In that sense where, much like The Green Knight, it has really good cinematography, good production values in terms of both the set and costume designs, and the plot is very similar in that sense where you have the main character who is a complete novice in their own right that goes on this epic journey to confront some kind of creature. And on top of that, the actual narrative itself is a dark fantasy that also deconstructs the tropes of the fantasy genre, albeit the execution is done very differently, but has a similar idea in that regards. And the movie also has really good special effects, from the practical effects to the go motion effects for the dragon itself. And because the movie is also a dark fantasy, it also dabbles in some elements that feel more like a horror movie than anything else. Also, to add on top of that, I just think this movie is really fun to watch. As for my second ultra recommendation for The Green Knight, I would recommend Angel's Egg. This is a movie that was directed by Maru Oshii, the same filmmaker who directed the 1995 Ghost in the Shell movie. And I recommend this one if you're someone who enjoyed the overall atmosphere and the philosophical aspects of The Green Knight. I think you might enjoy Angel's Egg. Sure, it's not a fantasy because it's more of a post-apocalyptic science fiction movie that also deals with the struggles of a man trying to grapple with his waning faith. But I mainly recommend this one because it does have a very similar bleak atmosphere to The Green Knight. And it's also predominantly a very meditative kind of movie, as you do have your main cast of characters trying to figure themselves out within the context of the narrative. Not only that, but this movie relies heavily on its visuals to tell its story. And it does have a lot of symbolism that does tie into the Christian Bible, that also ties into the narrative of the movie itself. Also, on top of that, the movie has a pretty short runtime of 71 minutes, so it goes by pretty quick. Coming in at number 2, Inception. Oh boy, where do I even begin with this one? Because at the time of its release, Inception was met with very high praise from both movie critics and casual moviegoers alike, to a point where it became the big event movie of 2010. And not only that, but moving forward, the amount of high praise this movie gets is just unreal. Because on top of having this movie show up on multiple top 10 best movies of 2010 lists, critically speaking, when you look at the Rotten Tomato score, it has a 87% for the critics and a 91% for the audience. Meanwhile, on IMDb's top 250 movie list, Inception comes in 14th place. Or when you see people do a ranking or tier list of Christopher Nolan movies, Inception usually shows up within the top 4, or sometimes I've seen some people label Inception as Christopher Nolan's best movie to date. Then, of course, when I sometimes look up YouTube videos, I remember Inception either popping up as top 10 best movies to hail from the 2010s, as in the decade, not the year, or I see this movie on multiple top 50 favorite movies of all time lists. It's just crazy the amount of high praise this movie gets, but enough about that. What kind of high praise did people give this movie at the time of its release? One of the biggest praises people gave was that the entire idea of the movie was very original, had amazing cinematography and special effects. People were blown away by the action. There was also quite a bit of people who also praised the movie for being more intellectual than your average blockbuster. Then, of course, there's debate about the ending of the movie because of its ambiguous nature, and so on and so forth. And I'm sorry, I think this movie's just okay at best. Because for me, I treat this movie like The Matrix in that sense where I remember watching it around the time of its release, and the movie for me literally went in one ear and out the other, and I only ever saw it the one time, and I'm gonna be honest, I never felt the need to watch the movie ever again. Because it didn't blow me away like it did for everybody else. Not only that, but why would I want to rewatch this movie when I could rewatch Paprika, which is quite literally Inception before Inception. But before going any further, I probably should give some praise to the movie because as far as the movie itself is concerned, I think it's a very well-made movie on a technical level. In that sense where, yes, it does have really good CGI. It also really does have good action scenes, with the highlight being the hallway fight scene. Not only that, but Hans Zimmer also provided a pretty good soundtrack to the movie. And as far as the actual narrative itself is concerned, conceptually, it's a heist movie, but instead of having your cast of characters trying to break into a place to steal something, they're trying to break into a place to give something, which is a unique spin on heist movies in that sense. So on a technical level, I do think Inception is a very well crafted movie. Everything else, on the other hand, needs more work. Starting with the characters, because with the exception of Leonardo DiCaprio's character of Cobb and Ellen Page, before she became transgender, character of Ariadne, everybody else to me was so forgettable, to a point that I do not remember their names, their mannerisms. Hell, I don't even remember what other actors appeared in this. I quite literally had to look up who else appeared in this movie, and I straight up forgot that Cillian Murphy, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Tom Hardy, and Ken Watanabe. I repeat, Ken freaking Watanabe. How in the hell did this movie make me forget Ken Watanabe was even in this? Seriously, I remember his role in Transformers Age of Extinction better than his role in this movie. But going back to the characters of Cobb and Ariadne, sure, I do remember them, but I also don't remember that much about them. Not only that, but the actual story, because I do remember it being kind of like a reverse heist, but I do not remember what the mission was. Because I remember this much. They're trying to enter someone's mind to plant an idea in their consciousness or something like that. But how they get from point A to point B to point C, I remember nothing about it. I mean, sure, I remember scenes here and there, such as the fight scene that occurs in the hallway, or to the points in time where a random train shows up, thanks to Cobb, and a scene set out of an avalanche, and then, of course, the points in time where the movie would periodically cut back to the van slowly falling into the river. Like, I remember that stuff, but why all those scenes occurred, I honestly do not remember. Because the movie doesn't do a good job of explaining what the stakes are. Sure, I do remember that Cobb and friends have to break into someone's mind to plant an idea, but this just leads to me asking a bunch of questions. One, why are they attempting this mission in the first place? Second, what are the stakes involved if they don't complete the mission? Third, what is the idea in question that Cobb and friends are trying to plant inside this other person's mind to begin with? Fourth, why do the support cast even decide to take part in this mission in the first place? 5, what is the urgency of the mission in terms of why do they need to complete it in the first place in case they fail? 6, who is the villain of the movie? And the thing is, I could keep going, but I think you get my point. Sure, like I said earlier, it has been a long time since I've seen the movie, since I haven't seen it since 2010, so I probably should have rewatched the movie, but again, why should I rewatch this if I could just be watching Paprika instead? And not only that, but narratively speaking, because the movie does a poor job of explaining what the stakes are, we don't get emotionally involved with the characters. And if we don't get emotionally involved with the characters, then why should we even care about their mission to begin with? Not only that, but going back to the villain thing, technically, I think Cillian Murphy's character is the villain, but he's not exactly active because you have our main cast of characters trying to infiltrate his mind. He's basically asleep, but his subconscious is the true villain of the movie. But even then, they don't really do much with it because when we do see Cillian Murphy's character's subconscious fight back against common friends, it just takes the form of cannon fodder goons. And the thing is, I think it would have been a lot more creative if we had common friends going up against some weird abstract ideas or visuals during the mission itself. Because when we just have our main cast of characters fight a bunch of goons, it gets boring after a while. I mean, you're inside someone's mind. They could have done some really cool creative visuals. And I know some people might say that, oh, the real villain of the movie isn't so much Cillian Murphy's character, it's really the ideas of grief and guilt are the real antagonists of the movie. But the thing is, not only are both ideas present in the narrative, but the narrative doesn't really do anything with them. Then, of course, you have the ending, which is ambiguous in nature, and I got so many problems with it, because I feel that when I saw the movie for the first time, it felt like it was trying to have an ambiguous ending, but my problems with the ending, from how I remember it, is that there's clear pieces of evidence present in the ending that points to Cobb being stuck in limbo. And by having these pieces of evidence, it to me makes the ending not as ambiguous as the movie thinks it is. Either that or I clearly just don't like ambiguous endings. Seriously, between this, The Green Knight, Only Yesterday, and Gamera 3, The Revenge of Iris, I clearly do not like movies that have an ambiguous ending to them, apparently. Then you have Christopher Nolan himself as a director, and to me, he's one of those individuals who is able to make a well-crafted movie, but only from a technical standpoint. I just feel that he needs a better script, or his scripts need a few more rewrites in order to make the movie work properly, in my opinion. And not only that, but because of the way he makes his movies, Nolan just makes dumb people feel like the intellectuals by making the movies the way they are. So, for my ultra recommendations, the first one goes to Paprika, the movie I've been comparing Inception to this entire time, because I am convinced that Christopher Nolan plagiarized this movie. Now, for point of reference, it's not the first time American filmmakers have taken heavy influence from anime movies. Case in point, the Wachowskis were heavily inspired by the 1995 Ghost in the Shell anime movie, which resulted in the creation of The Matrix. But at least I give The Matrix and the Wachowskis a pass on that front, because at least they admitted to say, yes, we were heavily influenced by this movie, but they at least went in their own direction with it. With Christopher Nolan, on the other hand, I'm very convinced that he saw Paprika first, and then took influence, in air quotes, and decided to make Inception And why I say this, if you were to watch Inception and Paprika, they have a lot of similar plot points and scenes to a point that I'm convinced Inception is just an Americanized remake of Paprika. Sure, narratively speaking, both Inception and Paprika are very different. With Inception, as I mentioned earlier, I compare it to a heist movie. With Paprika, it plays out more like a murder mystery. But that all said, why I would recommend Paprika over Inception. First off, on top of having very similar plot points to Inception, the animation's also visually amazing to look at. It's a lot more original with its concepts and ideas in terms of how they're executed. It's also directed by the late Satoshi Kon, who, for those of you who don't know, he was a Japanese filmmaker who only ever directed 4 movies and a TV show, which consisted of Paranoia Agent, Paprika, Tokyo Godfathers, The Millennium Actress, but his most famous work being Perfect Blue. Not only that, but this movie keeps you guessing in that sense where you have no idea whether or not the characters are in the real world or the dream world because the lines get blurred so often. You could honestly think a character could be in one place or the other. And not only that, but I found the characters in this movie, at least in comparison to the characters featured in Inception, to be better written and feel more fleshed out within the context of this movie. And not only that, but the movie is only 90 minutes and it goes by pretty quickly. And not only that, but the movie is just a visual feast for the eyes and has a really crazy climax. But anywho, enough about Paprika. As for my second alternate recommendation for Inception, I would recommend Dreamscape, a movie that I find to be very under-recommended for the following reasons. Reason number 1, it features a cast consisting of Dennis Quaid, Max von Sydow, Christopher Plummer, Kate Capshaw, and David Patrick Kelly. Reason number 2, this movie, to my knowledge, is one of the first movies to ever do the whole if you die in a dream, you die in reality plot device that would become popular with A Nightmare on Elm Street, which came out sometime after the release of this movie. Third, while some people might find a lot of the special effects in this movie to be very cheesy, I think the special effects are very charming and do fit a lot of the dreams that do occur throughout the whole movie itself. Not only that, but I do like the setup to the narrative where you have this guy who's psychic that gets recruited by the government that uses this technology to allow psychics like him to enter people's dreams to help them out. In this case, the President of the United States, who has recurring nightmares about nuclear fallout, and while trying to help out the president, the main character unravels an assassination plot against the president where he's trying to figure out, is the threat in the real world or within the dream world, which leads into the movie's genre, because Dreamscape is a genre mashup in that sense where, although it is predominantly a political espionage thriller, it also incorporates elements from sci-fi, horror, and adventure, resulting in a very unique movie. Another reason to watch the movie is, historically speaking, the second movie to receive a PG-13 rating at the time of its release. And before I go any further, here are my list of honorable mentions. The Wolf of Wall Street, the original Top Gun, American Psycho, A Silent Voice, Elf, that one movie we're not supposed to talk about, and finally, Ratatouille, and by extension, most of the Pixar catalog. And before I go any further, I should mention this again, just because I think a lot of the movies I've talked about on this list, I think are over-recommended, or overrated to those of you who prefer to use that term, does not mean I think the movies are bad. If anything, I still think some of these movies are okay to good, and I still think they're worth watching. I just don't think they're these grand masterpieces that people have made them out to be over the past several decades. But without further ado, the moment you've all been waiting for now has come down to this. The number one movie that I consider to be the most over-recommended movie of all time goes to none other than Pulp Fiction. Yeah, I know. There's probably a lot of you who are going to be either offended or disappointed that I consider Pulp Fiction to be the most over-recommended movie ever made, but I of a story attached to this, starting with my parents, because the first time I even heard of Pulp Fiction was through my parents. Not because they liked it, mind you, it's because of how much they hated it, because evidently at some point in time, they rented the movie and decided to watch it, and they just hated it so much that they stopped the movie 20 minutes in and never bothered to continue watching the movie ever again. Now, fast forward to my time during late middle school, early high school, and keep in mind, social media, while it did exist, wasn't as prevalent as it is in today's culture. So when I heard people talk about movies, it's usually through word of mouth, and a movie that everybody kept talking about was Pulp Fiction because of how awesome it is. And people talked about it so much, they constantly quoted lines of dialogue from the movie. So during my early high school years, I do remember trying to watch this movie for the first time on TV, and keep in mind, I did not know anything about the movie. All I knew was, okay, this is the movie that my parents hate, but everybody in school seems to love. So when I tried to watch it on TV the first time, I was just so confused as to what was going on because the movie was already half over, and I thought it was going to be a case of, okay, maybe I could just follow the plot to see what's going on. I was just confused to such a point that I stopped watching the movie altogether. Now, fast forward to my last 2 years of high school, where I went to a tech center for video production, and me and my classmates asked the, at the time, video instructor in terms of what movie do you consider to be the most epic movie of all time? And the response he gave was, well, if we're talking most recently, I would say The Dark Knight. But if we're talking all time, I give it to Pulp Fiction. So between the students that were in the video production course and the video instructor talking about the movie, it was a case of, okay, so even the instructor thinks this movie is epic and all this stuff. And then fast forward to my freshman year of college, and I don't remember the exact context, but I do remember watching this movie with a group of friends of mine. And as we sat there watching it, between me watching this movie for the first time and seeing them react to the movie, quoting it as the movie plays, I was just perplexed by what was going on because up to this point, I'd never seen the movie in full, so I was just taking it in. It wasn't until one of my friends looked at me and went, "You seem confused. Have you not seen this movie before?" And my response was, "No, this is my first time watching it." And quite literally, the room fell dead silent because everyone just looked at me like I had came from another planet, because it's just one of those movies that everybody had seen at some point during middle school or high school. So they were just confused by the fact that I had never seen the movie before. So fast forward to the point in time where the movie ends, and I just sat there just completely confused by everything about the movie in terms of what I had just seen and why everybody had kept praising the movie for the longest time. And before I go any further, I do apologize if I start to sound like a broken record here, but when I decided to look up the reception this movie gets online, again, much like The Matrix or Inception, this movie is very beloved by people, to such a point where if you type in favorite movies of all time, Pulp Fiction usually shows up, or when you see people doing a tier list or a ranking of Quentin Tarantino's movies, Pulp Fiction usually comes in at number 1. And then, of course, you have the Rotten Tomatoes score of 92% for the critics and 96% for the movie-going audience. It's also on multiple quintessential movies of the 1990s, and of course referring to the IMDb's top 250 list. Pulp Fiction quite literally comes in 8th place. I repeat, out of 250 movies, Pulp Fiction comes in 8th place. And I could keep going, but I think you get the point. This movie is highly praised by everybody. Now, before I go any further, I probably should give some praise to the movie before I tear it apart. One of the biggest praises I can give this movie is that it has a really epic soundtrack, a very memorable cast of actors, with the highlight, in my opinion, being Sam Jackson's performance, given that I think his performance is what carried this movie, and the reason why I think this movie is remembered to this day. Then, of course, you have the structure of the movie, where this I can actually understand why critics would like it from a structural standpoint, in the sense where the movie is told both in and out of order, with the actual narrative being told obviously out of order, but as a movie, it's told in order. I know that might sound confusing, but it makes sense when you pay attention to how a movie is structured. And the movie does have some pretty epic one-liners, and while the movie is predominantly a throwback to exploitation movies of the 1960s and 1970s, it uses those exploitation elements to give some social commentary that speaks to us about us in ways that your average Hollywood popcorn movie can't. Also, the movie does have a good dose of dark comedy, which isn't easy to pull off, but I think out of any movie that does incorporate dark comedy, Pulp Fiction is one of the better examples of a movie to utilize dark comedy. So overall, much like Inception, I do think Pulp Fiction is a very well crafted movie on a technical level. So, with that all said, what are my problems with the movie in terms of why I think this movie is overrecommended? I'm going to start with the acting first, because while I don't necessarily think any of the actors give a bad performance in this, the reason why I think Samuel L. Jackson's performance stands out so much in comparison to everybody else, with Samuel L. Jackson's performance, not only does he give a lot of charisma, but he also gives a lot of passion to the character he's playing. Whereas everybody else, while I don't think anybody's given a bad performance, it feels as if they're giving the bare minimum of what is required. In that sense where, yes, they're doing a fine job, but to me, it felt like they didn't put that much passion into their roles as much as Sam Jackson. Another problem that I have with the movie is a combination of both its runtime and pacing. Because, my god, on top of this movie being almost 3 hours long, the pacing makes it feel much longer than it really is. Because anytime I watch this movie, for the first several minutes, I'm actually really into the narrative. But the longer the movie goes on, it feels longer than it should, to such a point that I actually get bored with the movie at points, to a point that I just want to clock out and stop watching the movie altogether. Now, point in comparison, I like Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, where it's very similar, where it has a narrative that's told both in and out of order, but that movie is much shorter in comparison. And not only that, but it's paced in a way that's very brisk, where it feels like it uses its time very well, whereas Pulp Fiction, even though it's very lengthy, it feels like it doesn't know what to do with its time. It doesn't feel like it uses its runtime to its fullest advantage. Or if it does, it feels like they just add a bunch of scenes that didn't need to be there. And speaking of which, there are several scenes in this movie that I'm convinced didn't need to be there. Because to me, it felt like they didn't add anything to the narrative to such a point that I think you could have removed them altogether, and I don't think anything would have been affected. For example, the scene where you have Samuel L. Jackson and John Travolta's characters in their car driving to receive the briefcase. And along the way, you see their characters talking about McDonald's cheeseburgers for a couple minutes, and I sat there going, why is this relevant to the plot? What does this tell me about the characters? It feels like there was no purpose to it whatsoever, to such a point that I think you could have removed that scene altogether, and I don't think anything would have changed. And that's how I feel about a lot of the scenes that occur throughout the movie. There are just some points in time where an event happens, but I don't think it mattered in the long run, to a point that I think you, again, could have removed it altogether and nothing would have been affected. Another problem I have with the movie are the vignettes themselves, because with the exception of the Gold Watch vignette, the other vignettes that comprise of Pulp Fiction's narrative don't have any sense of structure to them. And what I mean by this, when you watch the Gold Watch vignette, it has structure in that sense where it clearly has a first, second, and third act. And a lot of stories should ideally have a 3-act structure. But when you watch all of the other vignettes, they don't really have much in the way of a 3-act structure. In that sense where they don't really have structure at all. They just start and end. Which leads into my next problem with the movie, that being the overarching narrative that all of these vignettes seem to comprise, because what is Pulp Fiction about? Is it about an average couple trying to commit a crime? Is it about a boxer trying to escape the clutches of a crime boss? Is it about two hitmen receiving a briefcase for their crime boss? Or is it about a hitman entertaining the crime boss's wife, only for things to go sideways? What is Pulp Pulp Fiction about, narratively speaking? Because despite having all of these different plot threads that interconnect with each other, it feels as if the actual narrative itself is about nothing. And the impression I get from watches is that I feel maybe Tarantino was trying to replicate Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas in that sense where here's this movie that's a slice of life about gangsters, and although I am not a big fan of Goodfellas, I feel that the slice of life narrative for that movie worked to its advantage because there is a clear-cut narrative from start to finish. With Pulp Fiction, on the other hand, despite having the central narrative being comprised of all of these interconnected stories, this results in Pulp Fiction, strangely enough, not having a cohesive central narrative, which might honestly be its biggest problem. Maybe because the movie has too much going on, it feels as if the movie doesn't have a proper focus. And I know a few minutes ago I did talk about how this movie had some social commentary, but I don't necessarily think the narrative reflects the social commentary in a way that it thinks it does. And I could keep going, but I think you get the point. So, what would my alternate recommendations be for Pulp Fiction? My first alternate recommendation would be Boondock Saints, which in my opinion is what I consider to be the most quintessential Pulp Fiction cash-in, given that it's not only a crime drama, which has some non-linear storytelling, where the narrative is told both in and out of order, it's also a movie that has a very similar sense of humor to that of Pulp Fiction. Not only that, but this was the breakout role for Norman Reedus before he ever hit it big on The Walking Dead. And the movie also features William Dafoe, who plays a character that some people of the LGBTQ community might find offensive, but I think his character is very entertaining from the moment he's introduced. And overall, I do think The Boondock Saints is a very entertaining movie in general. So, for my second ultra recommendation, I would recommend Go, a 1999 high school crime drama in which the story is told as an anthology where each segment is focused on a completely different character. And although each segment is different from one another, they all tie in together because the one thing linking each story is the fact that the main premise is you have a bunch of people who get caught up in a drug deal gone wrong, and we see the repercussions of said action. And what makes this movie unique is that it's not told from the point of view of gangsters. It's told from the point of view of a bunch of young, naive people who get in way over their heads. The movie's only about 80 to 90 minutes long, so it moves at a pretty brisk pace. It also features Melissa McCarthy in her first ever movie role, even if her role in the movie is nothing more than a glorified cameo in the grand scheme of things. And much like The Boondock Saints, Go is also a movie that took huge influence from Pulp Fiction, but goes in its own direction. And for my third and final ultra recommendation for Pulp Fiction goes to The Devil All the Time. This movie, in my opinion, is so highly underrecommended. And the plot to this movie revolves around a cast of sinister characters who converge around a young man devoted to protecting those he loves in a post-war backwoods town teeming with corruption and brutality. And this one also has a very similar storytelling method to that of Pulp Fiction, where it's told both in and out of order, where, yes, obviously the narrative is told out of order, but as a movie it's told in order. It features a pretty good ensemble cast ranging from Tom Holland, Bill Skarsgård, Sebastian Shaw, Robert Pattinson, among many others. And although the movie is very lengthy, it knows how to use its time very well. Not only that, but the movie is just really dark in general, which makes a lot of sense because the movie itself is sort of this gothic, psychological crime thriller, which makes a lot of sense. And not only that, but the two standout performances for me that worked to this movie's advantage is that of Tom Holland and Robert Pattinson, who is by far the best part of the movie, because this guy is chewing scenery left and right, and it's delightful to watch. And unlike the other two ultra recommendations, the setting to this movie is really unique in that sense, where it's not set in a contemporary setting like Boondock Saints or Go. This movie is a period piece because it takes place sometime during post-World War II America, leading into the 1960s. Not only that, but I just think in general, this movie has really great production values from the set and costume designs. It's also got really good cinematography. It's also edited very well. And it does touch on the themes of evil being disguised as good by abusing religion to commit terrible atrocities. So overall, I highly recommend The Devil All the Time because this one is for the ages. That's all I'm gonna say. And there you have it. Those are the 10 movies that I consider to be the most overrecommended movies of all time. So, what are some movies that you think are overrated or overrecommended, and what would your alternate recommendations be for said movie? And see you later.